Imagine for a moment that you are holding the exact architectural blueprint to a massive, life-saving fortress.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, and you study this blue paper every single day, you know. You memorize every white line, every weird symbol, every mathematical notation.
Yeah, you become totally obsessed with it.
Exactly. You revere this document. But then when the day finally comes and you arrive at the actual fully constructed fortress,
Let me guess, you refuse to go inside.
yes, you refuse to go inside. And why? Because the real fortress is made of stone and wood, and you were looking for something made of blue paper. You completely confuse the symbol for the reality.
It's a devastating cognitive trap, really.
Yeah.
And it happens because human beings have this profound tendency to fall in love with the map
Yeah.
while completely ignoring the actual territory it represents.
Which brings us to today's deep dive. We are exploring a fascinating collection of historical and theological sources that deal with this exact phenomenon, but, on a massive civilization-altering scale.
Right.
Our mission today is to examine how ancient texts function as a sort of document of evidence, like a predictive blueprint. We're going to break down how misreading highly metaphorical spiritual language as rigid literalism led to one of the most tragic and deeply ironic executions in human history.
Yeah, and to really understand what happened, we have to look at how these sources reframe the entire Old Testament.
Meaning everything from Genesis to Malachi.
Yeah, exactly. The Genesis and Malachi. They don't treat those books as just, a dusty historical record or a collection of moral fables.
Right.
The text is presented as a meticulously crafted predecessor document. It's a covenant, a binding predictive blueprint designed with one singular focus, which is to serve as undeniable evidence when the reality it described finally arrived.
Let's lay the groundwork for that, actually, because the sources draw heavily on a specific passage to establish this framework. They point straight to John chapter 5, verse 39.
Oh, that's a crucial one.
Right. In this text, Jesus is speaking directly to the ultimate religious experts of his day. These are the scholars who had memorized the scriptures. And he says to them, "You study the scriptures diligently, because you think that in them you have eternal life. These are the very scriptures that testify about me."
Yeah.
He is essentially telling them, look, you are gripping the right document, but you have entirely misunderstood what it is actually evidence for.
Well, if you look closely at the mechanics of a prophecy or a predictive covenant, the entire point of writing something down in advance is validation.
Yeah, absolutely.
The sources argue that God made promises through the prophets specifically so that when the events finally materialized in the real world, the evidence would be completely verifiable to anyone holding the document.
So the text is the prerequisite.
Precisely.
Mhm.
You have to understand the predecessor text to recognize its real-world manifestation.
Which goes right back to that blueprint analogy we started with. Like,
Yeah.
if you hand me a blueprint for a modern skyscraper, I'm just looking at a two-dimensional sheet of paper. If I don't know how to translate that symbolic language into three-dimensional reality, I could be standing right inside the finished marble lobby of that exact skyscraper.
And have absolutely no idea.
Exactly. I'd have no idea I'm inside the building the blueprint was describing. I'd just be walking around the lobby looking for flat white lines on the floor.
And take that analogy a step further. If you take the blueprint literally, you'd be trying to live inside a rolled-up piece of blue paper.
Right.
You'd be hoarding the paper while the actual building was standing right next to you, completely empty. And the ancient scholars described in these sources were essentially doing just that.
They treated the words of the prophets as the final reality.
Yeah, rather than a placeholder. The entire Old Testament text was designed to testify about the coming of a specific reality, which obviously in the context of these sources is Jesus.
I'm stuck on something here, though. Let's really look at the psychology of this. If this blueprint was read out loud in the synagogues every single week, like if these scholars dedicated their entire waking lives to studying every comma, every period, every nuance of that text,
Yeah.
how is it cognitively possible to miss the fulfillment when it is literally standing right in front of them?
Well, the sources address that paradox directly,
Mm-hmm.
and it leads us right into the historical tragedy found in the book of Acts.
Acts chapter 13, right?
Yes, Acts chapter 13, specifically verses 25 through 27. The answer to your question comes down to the illusion of knowledge.
Oh, wow. The illusion of knowledge.
Yeah, because when you are so steeped in a text, when it becomes the absolute foundation of your cultural and political identity, you stop reading it for discovery. You just start reading it for confirmation.
Let's break down the mechanics of what Acts 13 actually says happened there.
So the passage explains that the rulers and the people in Jerusalem lived by the Old Testament. They heard the words of the prophets read aloud every single Sabbath.
Every single week.
Every week. They were completely immersed in the text. However, the passage explicitly states that because they did not truly understand the voices of those prophets they were hearing every week, they condemned Jesus.
Wow.
And the staggering historical irony is this: in the very act of condemning and executing him, they unwittingly fulfilled the exact scriptures they had been meticulously studying.
When you frame it that way, like memorizing a text but destroying its actual subject, it forces you to ask what rote memorization actually does to the human brain.
Oh, totally.
Because they didn't like access to the text. They had the scrolls. They had the words memorized backwards and forwards.
All the data.
Right, but it sounds like the sheer repetition might have actually blinded them. It's almost like semantic satiation, you know?
Remind me how that works again.
It's when you stare at a word so long or repeat a word so many times that it loses all its meaning and just becomes a sound.
Oh, right. Yes, that is a very apt psychological comparison. The repetition created this deep groove in their minds, a rigid expectation of what the fulfillment had to look like.
So it wasn't a lack of data.
Not at all. It was a fatal lack of comprehension. They were waiting for a physical, geopolitical kingdom.
They wanted a literal military conqueror to free them from Rome.
Exactly. They were so fiercely attached to their literal physical expectations of the prophecy that they became entirely blind to the spiritual fulfillment. The leadership didn't know the true internal meaning of the scriptures.
And because of that ignorance, they executed the very subject the scriptures were pointing to.
Yes.
I have to challenge this dynamic, though. I mean, if the stakes of misunderstanding this text were literally life and death.
Yeah, high stakes.
Extremely. If misinterpreting the blueprint leads you to commit an atrocity, why is the blueprint written like a puzzle in the first place?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Right. Why hide the true meaning in symbols, metaphors, and parables? Why not just write plainly, hey, the fulfillment will be a spiritual teacher, not a military leader?
It's a critical point to make. Why the metaphors? Well, the sources argue that it's not about intentionally tricking the reader.
Okay.
It's actually about the fundamental limits of human language.
What do you mean by that?
Well, spiritual or metaphysical realities simply cannot be fully captured using physical, literal descriptions. We just don't have the vocabulary for it.
Oh, I see.
So physical language serves as a necessary vessel, a metaphor, to convey a much deeper internal reality.
So we have to use the physical world as a stand-in just to even begin to discuss the spiritual world.
Exactly that. And if you only read the physical vessel, you miss the contents entirely. And the sources don't just leave us with this abstract problem, they actually provide a specific decoder key, if you will.
To show how this works in practice.
Yes, they point to some of the most famous metaphors in the entire biblical text, starting right at the beginning, the very first chapter of Genesis.
Genesis chapter 1, the creation account. Let there be light.
Right. Now, when a reader approaches Genesis 1 with a rigid, literal mindset, what do they picture?
Literal photons, I guess. The physical sun, physical light, pushing away physical darkness in the material universe.
Exactly. That is the standard surface-level reading. But the sources challenge that literalism by bringing in a completely different text to decode it.
Which text?
2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6.
Okay, how does 2 Corinthians decode the Genesis account?
Well, the Apostle Paul writes, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Christ."
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Paul has taken the very first physical event of the text light shining in the darkness, and he is explicitly decoding it as a spiritual metaphor.
So the light they were reading about in Genesis, it isn't a light bulb. It isn't the sun in the sky.
No. According to this framework, the physical light in Genesis was a blueprint symbol. It was pointing toward spiritual enlightenment. Specifically, the illuminating knowledge of God's glory revealed through Jesus.
That completely changes how you read it.
It does, and the sources further corroborate this decoding method by pointing to the book of John. In John 8:12, Jesus explicitly takes on this metaphor, saying, "I am the light of the world."
Right, right.
And he repeats it again in John 12:46, "I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness."
You know, this makes perfect sense when you think about how we use language naturally,
Yeah.
especially in poetry or deep emotional expressions.
How so? Give me an example.
Well, if someone looks at their partner and says, "You are my sunshine,"
Ah,
Right, it's sweet. But if you force a literal interpretation onto that phrase,
Yeah.
you fundamentally destroy its meaning.
Right, because you would be assuming they're claiming their partner is literally a massive ball of burning radioactive gas suspended in the vacuum of space.
Exactly. Which completely misses the point of the communication.
It's absurd.
Yeah. By taking the word sunshine literally, you obliterate the actual truth of the statement. The truth is about warmth and joy in this life-giving presence.
Exactly.
The literal interpretation is factually ridiculous, but the metaphorical interpretation contains a profound human truth.
And that is exactly what the sources are arguing. By taking the concept of light in the Old Testament literally, the ancient religious leaders were basically looking up at the sky for physical signs.
Waiting for literal material evidence.
Yes, completely missing the actual spiritual illumination that was standing right in front of them in the person of Jesus. And the sources actually double down on this with another massive example from Genesis.
Oh, really? What's the second example?
Genesis chapter 2, the tree of life.
Oh, right, in the Garden of Eden.
Exactly. Again, with a literal mindset, people read that and they picture a literal biological tree with physical branches and physical fruit that you could bite into.
Yeah, like some kind of magical apple tree.
Right. But just like the light, it's a profound metaphor. It's not a real physical tree at all.
Okay, so what is the decoder key for the tree of life?
It's the book of John again. You look at John 14.6, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. And then he makes the plant metaphor incredibly explicit in John 15.1.
Wait, what does he say there?
He says, I am the true vine.
Oh, wow. So the tree of life from Genesis 2 was another symbol, another blueprint pointing directly to him.
Exactly. The physical tree was just the vessel for the spiritual reality.
It's amazing when you put it together like that. You've got the Old Testament text Genesis through Malachi acting as this massive, cohesive evidence document. But if you're looking for physical bark and physical leaves, you miss the true vine entirely.
Right. And you have to understand, the psychological safety of literalism cannot be overstated here.
What do you mean by psychological safety?
Well, think about those ancient scholars. Their entire societal status, their authority, their whole worldview was built on their mastery of the literal text.
Oh, I see.
For them, admitting that the text was actually this vast spiritual metaphor that was terrifying.
Because literalism is binary. It's safe.
Exactly. A physical light is easy to categorize. A physical tree is easy to imagine. A physical kingdom with a king on a throne is easy to measure. But a spiritual truth,
That requires nuance.
it requires nuance, and more importantly, it requires you to change internally. The tragedy of Acts 13 is the tragedy of people who chose the safety of the physical blueprint over the transformative reality of the actual building.
And this is where the deep dive has to pivot from ancient history to our own modern reality.
Definitely.
Because the sources are very clearly not just giving us a history lesson about ancient Jerusalem here, they are using this massive historical failure as a mirror.
Yes. The sources repeatedly warn against repeating this exact cognitive mistake today.
Right.
They hammer home the idea that simply holding a physical book or, walking into a physical building once a week or robotically repeating words, it is absolutely not enough. They introduce this concept of the new covenant.
Let's define that term for the listener. Because new covenant can sound like insider theological jargon. What does that actually mean in the context of reading the blueprint?
Right. Fair point. In this context, the new covenant represents a shift from an external physical agreement to an internal spiritual reality.
Okay.
The old covenant was all about external rule following, literal interpretations, physical rituals. The new covenant requires the internal law. It demands actual spiritual comprehension.
So grasping the meaning behind the metaphor?
Exactly. The sources argue that if you don't grasp the internal spiritual reality behind the text, you are entirely capable of ending up exactly like those ancient leaders in Acts 13.
Meaning, you could dedicate your entire life to a belief system, but because you only understand the surface-level mechanics of it, you might end up actively persecuting or just entirely missing the very truth you claim to be seeking.
Yes. The physical actions, the rituals, the attendance, the reading, they're rendered completely meaningless without deep, critical comprehension.
Because if you expect the building to look exactly like the flat blue piece of paper,
You will walk right past the front door of the actual structure.
man. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? How do you actually apply this? Because this isn't just a theological warning, right? It is a fundamental lesson about human psychology.
Oh, absolutely.
It's about how we process information in our daily lives. We are constantly interacting with our own texts, our media, our political ideologies, our company mission statements, our personal philosophies.
Right?
Are we reading the texts of our own lives entirely on a literal surface level?
It's such an important question. Because we live in an era of unprecedented information overload, we have access to more data, more blueprints than any generation in human history.
So many blueprints.
But having access to the document doesn't mean you understand the evidence it presents. When you engage with your core beliefs, are you actually questioning your own underlying assumptions? Or are you just confirming your biases?
Are you truly understanding the complex, nuanced reality of the information you consume? Or are you just like blindly repeating the modern equivalent of those ancient Sabbath readings?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Because it's so easy to recite the slogans, share the viral posts, and just parrot the talking points of your chosen ideology without ever grasping the complex internal reality behind them. It really feels like we've replaced ancient religious literalism with modern ideological literalism.
That is the core psychological danger the sources are pointing to.
Hmm.
The human brain still loves certainty just as much as it did 2,000 years ago.
We really do.
We still prefer the literal and the binary because it requires far less mental energy.
It's easier.
It is. It takes serious effort to look past the physical placeholder and imagine the multidimensional reality it represents. It requires persistent, humble, critical thinking to pause and say, maybe my rigid expectations of how this is supposed to look are actually blinding me to what is truly here.
Let's take a breath and recap the mechanisms we've explored today because we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
We started by looking at the Old Testament through a completely different lens. Not as a standard history book, but as a meticulously designed predictive evidence document.
Yes.
A blueprint specifically pointing to a future reality, which the sources identify as Jesus based on John 5.39.
Right. We then analyze the devastating psychological and historical irony found in Acts 13.
Where the experts completely missed it.
Exactly. The most dedicated, educated scholars of that blueprint rigidly clung to their literal interpretations because rote memorization and literalism blinded them to the true voices of the prophets.
So they completely missed the reality when it arrived, and tragically, they unwittingly fulfilled the darkest parts of the prophecy by executing the subject of the text.
Yeah, and we saw exactly how that cognitive trap works by decoding the metaphors.
Right, the examples.
They read about the light in Genesis 1 and expected physical signs, completely missing the spiritual enlightenment, the light of the world, described in 2 Corinthians and the Gospel of John.
And same with the tree of life in Genesis 2.
Exactly. Looking for physical fruit and completely missing the true vine from John 15. They confused the physical vessel for the spiritual reality it contained.
And as we've discussed, the sources warn us that this cognitive trap is not confined to the ancient world at all. The tendency to mistake the symbol for the substance is a deeply ingrained human vulnerability.
It's everywhere.
Which brings us right back to that architectural blueprint we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive.
With the blue paper.
The blue paper. The blueprint wasn't wrong. The blue paper and the white lines were perfectly accurate. It was the rigid, literal, two-dimensional interpretation of those lines that kept a person standing outside in the cold instead of entering the fortress.
Because the failure is never in the existence of the evidence. The failure is in the reader's refusal to understand the language in which the evidence is written.
Exactly. So here is a lingering question for you to mull over long after this audio stops playing.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the most highly educated, passionately dedicated scholars of the ancient world completely misunderstood their primary text with literal civilization-altering consequences simply because of their rigid literal expectations,
Right.
what fundamental truths might you be completely blind to right now simply because you are taking your own modern blueprints too literally?
Wow. It's a question that demands we constantly reevaluate our own certainties and our own blind spots.
It really is. Thank you for taking this deep dive into the text with us today. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the two-dimensional surface of the things you read, and we will catch you on the next one.